We're going to talk about something many of us have probably heard of, and probably experienced. That too, we've probably experienced. I'm going to talk about mental health stigma. Dealing with a mental health illness is tough as it is, but stigma just takes it to another level. My name is Helena Okiring, and I'm your host for the show. Hello, welcome to the Mindful Show. The Mindful Show is dedicated to all things mental health. We discuss mental health awareness, prevention, and all other things that are good for the fitness of your mind. If you watched the first episode of Mindful, I shared my personal experience of surviving mental health distress or illness. And I shared that I lost a job, because I lost a job and I did not know why. I was fired, when I sought to return from work after surviving a mental health illness. One of the things I struggled with was why? Why did this happen? How could this happen? Why me? There was no procedure followed, nothing. The HR didn't call me, nothing. I have come to learn that what I experienced was possibly a case of stigma. So what is stigma? Stigma is a mark of shame, disgrace, associated with having or not having a particular trait. Mental illness stigma, in particular, is about projecting negative stereotypes, perceptions, and really just uninformed beliefs towards persons struggling or surviving mental health related illnesses. Stigma includes different things. It could include acts of discrimination. You discriminate against someone purely because, they have a mental illness condition, or you shame them, or you deny them access to something. It could be health. All those are forms of stigma. Mental health stigma also includes just having negative perceptions towards the issue of mental health. Whenever we speak about mental health, we're speaking about mental illness. We associate the whole conversation with a pathology. So what that means is we pathologize conversations to do with mental health. And what that does is it makes us think mental health affects some people more than it does others. The treatment of people with mental health issues, like treating them differently or stigmatizing them, has a very long, dark history. It hasn't just started with us, it's been going on for ages. In some circles, mental illness was used, pronouncing you as a mentally ill person was used as a form of controlling political dissent, So it was not uncommon. People who had different views, people who thought, differently about things were often labeled mad. And I think it even carries on today. When someone tells you something you aren't expecting or shares an idea that's out of the ordinary, the first thing you most likely ask them is, are you crazy? So that is a contemporary interpretation of this. So this whole idea of stigma, this whole idea of, isolating or criminalizing, mental illness is not new to our time and generation. It's been going on for hundreds of years, and it has a very, very dark history. I think it was French philosopher Michel Foucault who even argued that mental health prevention, or rather mental health illnesses, or declaring people as mentally ill, was actually a way to protect certain power hierarchies upon which the capitalist bourgeoisie state survived on. In other words, it was important for those in power to protect their interests. And how they did that was preventing people who had different views and ideas of how society should be from having space to share them. Once people were declared mad or mentally, quote unquote, mad or mentally unwell, they were locked up in asylums, never to be seen or heard from again. So that has continued today in different ways and forms. Now, today, of course, we're not locking people up like we did back then, but we definitely have a very long way to go when it comes to battling stigma. So, I'm learning that stigma actually operates at different levels. There are different, levels at which stigma operates, and I challenge us, I implore us to identify, the types of stigma that may be at work, in your workplace, in your family, and even in your personal life. The first type of stigma is structural stigma. This is a situation where there are laws, policies that blatantly discriminate against persons suffering with mental health. So mental illness, or having challenges related to mental illness. So if you look at your human resource policy, for example, I think a couple of insurance providers, medical insurance providers in Uganda still do not cover mental illness under their cover, and it's their policy, that's their way of working. So that's a form of structural stigma. It's in the laws, it's in the way you work. The other type of stigma is self-stigma. So self-stigma is a situation where you hate yourself, you start to loathe yourself, to despise yourself because you are struggling with or trying to get help for a mental health condition. Maybe when you find out, you're dealing with depression, you start to hate you hate everything about your life, you despise yourself, and this has effects on you. Your esteem goes down, you take to acts of self-sabotage. For example, maybe you have an interview coming up and you are qualified for it, like you will cut it. But because of self-stigma, you cut yourself out, you don't even give yourself a chance to try, because you berate yourself purely because of a mental health condition you are struggling with. That's the second type of stigma. The third type of stigma, which I was actually amazed to learn about, is courtesy stigma. So, like the name suggests, courtesy stigma is stigma that is inflicted upon persons who are looking after people who are dealing with mental health illness. I shared with you guys my story. I had 3 caretakers, like 3 of my friends were looking after me, and I mean looking after me literally, from helping me to go, to the hospital, to driving me there, to helping me to, reminding me to take my meds. When I had just fallen sick, they had to help me like with bathing and everything because my body was in so much pain. And it takes a lot to look after mental health patient. It takes a lot. So courtesy stigma in that case would have been a situation where my friends would have been looked at negatively because they were giving me support and help. And the very last form of stigma is public stigma. And this is where members of a population just despise people with mental health illness. You treat them like trash. You cut them out. Like, you shut them up. You think they don't know what they're saying. You don't give them an opportunity purely on the basis that they're struggling with a mental health illness. It also means that a society generally despises, anything to do with mental health. So having learned the different types of stigma, this is a good time to ask yourself, what kinds of stigma may I be perpetrating? If you are a leader in an organization, this is a good time to look through your policies and check what is it that we might be doing or having in policy, in our procedures, in our manuals, in the way that we are working, that might be discriminating against persons struggling with mental health. In the family, check what are your attitudes when maybe someone comes home and says, I'm struggling with this. Do you laugh at them? Do you tell them big boys don't cry? Rest in peace, Bob Marley. Was it Bob Marley? No, it wasn't Bob Marley. It was Lucky Dube. Yes. He was the one that said big boys don't cry. Anyway, they actually do. So if you're watching this and you're a big boy, please cry like if you need to. That said, it's so important we are very conscious of this. So the other thing I am learning about is that stigma operates in a cycle, as with all problems, that we have, as with all chronic problems. So the stigma cycle has 5 phases. So the first thing in the stigma cycle is negative perceptions around mental health. And I want us to do a quick test right now. When you think of, say, mental health hospital, what's the first image that comes to your mind? Do you think of a normal hospital, or do you think of a place where people are tied up and, everybody is just, all over the place and out of control? When you think about a person struggling with mental illness, would you think of me, for example? And yet it's true, I've actually struggled with mental illness. Yeah. When you think of a psychiatrist or a person who helps patients who are struggling with mental illness issues, what kind of image comes to your mind? Do you think of someone opening up or drilling into your brain and pulling out someone's brain? Or you think of a qualified professional who's actually helping people and saving lives? If you had negative perceptions, or if you had the more scary, exaggerated perception, that right there is an example of a negative perception around mental health. The second bit in the cycle of mental health stigma is the fear of discrimination. This drives stigma like no other. People are afraid to speak out because they're afraid when they do, they'll get isolated, they'll be terminated from their jobs, they'll lose friends, they'll lose spouses. I mean, think about it as you are watching this. If you are on a date and someone said they'd struggled with depression or anxiety, what would you think? I remember speaking with a friend of mine, about what had happened to me. And he said, first of all, you're an African, you don't get those kinds of things. And then two, he basically told me, you need to be strong. That stuff is not for African women. And he also told me it's for white people, quote unquote, it's a white people condition. So that kind of discrimination, that if I come out and say I'm struggling with this, I'll not be thought of as African enough, I'll not be thought of as woman enough, I'll not be thought of as strong, is what makes many people keep quiet, is what makes many people hide their pain. So the fear of discrimination is a key driver of stigma. And when we discriminate, we basically have a perception that, mental health affects them, not us. So we other people who have, mental health challenges, and we discourage them from getting help. So instead of thinking we think you versus us. Discrimination leads to the next stage, which is just avoidance or fear of accessing help and resources. When we perpetuate stigma and people are afraid, they totally resent or avoid getting help and resources. They don't go to see psychiatrists, they don't go for psychosocial support, they are embarrassed to talk to counselors, and before you know it, something that could have been managed becomes a full-blown problem purely because of stigma. Someone was afraid to go and look for resources. The avoidance of resources now leads to the next problem, which is untreated mental illness. If people are avoiding resources, then what happens? They don't say anything, they don't go and get help, and then you have more and more and more people struggling with mental illness conditions. Now, I understand not all of us may be in situations where we can access resources, and I understand that there are also stereotypes around how expensive therapy is. I also know that it actually is expensive in some contexts. I remember when I was doing psychotherapy, an organization had to help me, to support that bill. So it is expensive for a fact. However, every health center now in Uganda, speaking to Ugandans now, but every health center now has some form of psychosocial support. And with the whole COVID pandemic, mental illness or mental health is something people are paying more attention to. So, you don't have to avoid resources. We don't have to avoid resources anymore because they're available now. They may not be as affordable as we would want them to be, but there's certainly somewhere we can start. Finally, the cycle ends in stigma, right? So those are the 5 stages of the stigma cycle. It starts with stigma, and then it goes to negative perceptions of mental illness, which perpetrate discrimination, which encourage people to avoid getting help altogether. And then we have mental illness that continues, and then we are back to stigma. So that's the stigma cycle. Okay, so stigma has the following side effects. And to help us remember, I am going to share them using the acronym STIGMA. S, stigma stops people from seeking the help that they need. T, stigma teaches people to focus on the negative aspects of mental health as opposed to the positive ones. I, stigma isolates people. It isolates sufferers, it isolates victims, it isolates those who need our help the most. G, it gives people feelings of shame and unworthiness. M, it marks people based on their mental health status rather than on their capacities and abilities. In that sense, it means we miss out on people's skill and the benefit that we could get from it purely because we're associating their condition with an inability, which may not always be the case. And finally, A, for alienation. Stigma alienates people who need our help the most. So the question is, how do you know that you are stigmatizing? Again, so this episode is full of acronyms, and that's why I enjoyed preparing for it. So that there's a simple test you can actually do to check if you as an individual harbor feelings of stigma towards persons struggling with mental health illness or mental health in particular. And I'm going to share this using the acronym STOP. Just like stop stigma, S-T-O-P. So, how do you recognize, how do you do this test? This is the first question you must ask yourself. Do your attitudes stereotype people with mental health or mental illness conditions? Do you have presuppositions, mostly negative, around people with mental health? So, are you peddling stereotypes? All right? That's the first S. The next is T. Do you trivialize people who have mental health or mental illness challenges? Do you dismiss them? Do you think of them as less? If your brother came and told you he needs to see a therapist, what's the first thing you do? Do you look at him and ask, what do you need to see a therapist for? Do you tell him, be strong? Or do you offend people who are struggling with a mental health issue? In other words, do you make fun of them? Do you shame them in public? Do you, even in some subtle way, deliberately make their lives hard because they're struggling with a condition? And the last P is, do you patronize? Do you treat people who have mental health conditions like, you're better than all of them? Do you dismiss them on that ground immediately? Do you patronize? Do you bully purely because they have mental health conditions, right? So if you answered yes, check, man. You just need to cleanse that stigma out of your system this instant. And if you answered no, then there's hope for you. But even if you answered yes, we can still do something about it. Question is, what do we do? So we're going to close this by talking about how we can end stigma. And your very last acronym for the day is UNITE. We need to unite, U-N-I-T-E, to end stigma. U is for understanding. Try and empathize. We can't all be perfect. We can't all know anything. But in as much as it depends upon you, try and understand what mental health is about and what mental health illness is about. Read about it, learn about it, and that's why we are sharing resources on this channel from different platforms, including the Ministry of Health, World Health Organization, to help us understand. Because once you understand, you know better. Rather, you do better. When we know better, we do better. The next N is for nurturing mental health. So nurture your mental health and the mental health of those around you. Take proactive steps. On this show, we talk about the steps we can take, whether that's being mindful of yourself, whether that's checking in with yourself, whether that's just going for therapy, whether that's reaching out to somebody who's struggling and encouraging them to go for therapy. All of that is a way in which we can nurture. So the first one is understand. The second is nurture. The third is include. Just be inclusive. Be inclusive of others. If you know someone struggling with a mental health illness, do not leave them out on the basis of that. Hang out with them, talk to them, do not isolate them. The next T is talk. Just start to talk about this. On the Mindful Show, we're talking about this. So talk about this, post about this. Let's remove the shame, because stigma is perpetrated by silence and this breeds shame. So let's just start talking about it. Let's make mental health as cool to talk about as we talk about diets, as we talk about fashion and style. Let that be part of our conversation. In the same way you ask your friends, how are you doing? Ask them, how's your mind? How are you? Let it be part of the conversation. And the last E is embrace therapy. Therapy is not for weird people. It's not for mad people. Therapy is actually part of a healthy lifestyle. For those of us who are watching and we are mothers, fathers, we head families, head organizations, some of the tasks that we take on can be so overwhelming, and sometimes we break under the weight, but it's not because we are not able, but simply because we have not sought space to process what we are going through and how we can do things better. Therapy, one of the things that therapy did for me was it helped me to see what I had gone through from a very different perspective. I stopped being angry. I stopped being resentful because of what had happened. And I realized maybe this was something I could learn from and use to help others. So is it with you. When you go and see a therapist, you will see things differently. You will appreciate whatever it is you're dealing with differently. When I struggled with my mental health challenge, my friends, my family were around me. They spoke with me, they believed in me, they walked the journey with me. They did not berate me because of what I was going through. As a result, I am here today purely because they decided to walk that journey with me. So I know stigma is a huge problem in our society, but it is not bigger than our collective capacity for empathy, for understanding, for love, And by doing that, we can each take a step to end stigma. So remember to unite to stop stigma. I have been your host for The Mindful Show, Helena Okiring, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.